100 years, David. A century of whispered promises and blood-sworn vows. Lisa's voice was a ragged whisper that cut through the silence of the moonlit clearing. She stepped out from the shadows of the ancient silver-barked pines, her gaze fixed on the tangled silhouette beneath the moon tree's luminous canopy. And you choose tonight, our sacred anniversary, to break them? The Alpha King froze, the woman in his arms twisting away with a startled gasp. He turned slowly, the ethereal light illuminating the stark horror in his golden eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. Not tonight. Not ever. The scent of rain and impending devastation thickened the air, heavy with the undeniable truth. The reign of the Iron Wolf was fracturing, starting with the very heart he'd sworn to protect. The air in the high halls of Silverpine was thick with the scent of roasted venison, pine needles, and the intoxicating, heady aroma of night-blooming jasmine. Lisa's signature scent. It was a fragrance that usually brought David a profound sense of peace, a tether to his humanity amidst the brutal realities of ruling the northern packs. Tonight, however, it felt stifling. He adjusted the stiff collar of his ceremonial tunic, the heavy silver embroidery feeling like chainmail against his skin. "Aren't nervous, my king?" Elias, his beta and oldest friend, materialized beside him, 2 crystal goblets of crimson wine in hand. David took a goblet, his fingers brushing Elias's. "It's our centennial mating anniversary, Elias. A momentous occasion. The pack expects a spectacle. The pack expects their king and queen to reaffirm their bond under the moon tree." Elias corrected gently, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "They look to you, David. To both of you. Your strength is their strength." David took a long swallow of the wine, the tartness sharp on his tongue. "And if that strength is compromised?" Elias frowned, the playful demeanor vanishing. "Compromised? What are you talking about? Has the Shadow Pack been sighted near the borders again?" "No. Nothing like that." David turned away, gazing out the towering windows. Below the courtyard was a sea of shifting bodies. Wolves in their human forms mingling, laughing, celebrating the enduring bond of their leaders. A bond that, to David, felt increasingly like a fragile thread. "It's complicated, Elias. Matters of state, matters of the heart, David." Elias's voice was low, laced with concern. "If there's something wrong, you need to tell me. We've faced rogue alphas, harsh winters, and famine together. Don't shut me out now." "I can't," David muttered, running a hand through his dark hair, a nervous habit he'd never quite managed to break. "Not tonight. Tonight is for Lisa. For the pack." He forced a smile, clapping Elias on the shoulder. "Come. The feast awaits. And I shouldn't keep my queen waiting." He found her in the center of the great hall, a vision in shimmering silver silk that clung to her curves like a second skin. Her dark hair was piled high, adorned with a simple silver diadem, a stark contrast to the heavy gold crown he wore. As he approached, the crowd parted, heads bowing in reverence. "You look breathtaking," he murmured, taking her hand and pressing a kiss to her knuckles. Her skin was cool, a stark contrast to the nervous heat radiating from him. Lisa smiled, a practiced, serene expression that didn't quite reach her eyes. "And you look tense, David. Is everything all right?" "Just the weight of a century, my love." He lied smoothly, leading her towards the high table. And the anticipation of the ceremony. The feast was a blur of toasts, boisterous laughter, and the clinking of goblets. David played the part of the devoted Alpha King flawlessly, smiling when required, acknowledging the tributes with a nod of his head. But his mind was elsewhere, fixated on the secret meeting he'd arranged for midnight. A meeting that could secure the future of Silverpine or destroy everything he held dear. As the moon reached its zenith, casting a silvery glow over the valley, the time came for the ritual. The pack gathered at the edge of the ancient forest, their voices rising in a haunting, harmonious howl that vibrated in David's chest. "It's time," Lisa said softly, slipping her hand into his. They walked together, a silent procession of two, into the heart of the woods. The path was illuminated by glowing mushrooms and the ethereal light of the moon tree, a colossal, ancient oak whose leaves shimmered with an inner luminescence. It was here, beneath its sprawling branches, that they had first sworn their oaths a century ago. "I'll meet you there," David whispered, stopping abruptly just before the clearing. I need a moment. Just a moment to center myself." Lisa frowned, a flicker of apprehension crossing her features. "David, what is it? We're supposed to approach the tree together." "I know, and we will. Just wait here for a minute. Please." Before she could protest, he turned and slipped into the dense undergrowth, his movements silent and swift. He navigated the familiar path with practiced ease, his heart hammering against his ribs. He had to be quick. He had to finish this before Lisa realized he was gone. He reached the designated spot, a small, secluded grove, a stone's throw from the moon tree. A figure stood waiting in the shadows, cloaked in a dark riding habit. "You're late," a feminine voice murmured, stepping into a patch of moonlight. It was Alara, the emissary from the southern packs, a beautiful, cunning wolf with eyes the color of dark amber. "The feast went longer than expected," David replied curtly, keeping his distance. "Have you brought the treaty?" Alara smiled, a slow, predatory curve of her lips. "I have. But the terms have changed, David. My alpha requires a more personal assurance of your commitment." David's jaw clenched. "What kind of assurance?" "A union," Alara stated flatly. "A political marriage between our packs, you and me." "You're insane," David hissed, his voice barely a whisper. "I am mated, bound to Lisa. A century of vows. Vows can be broken, David." Alara countered smoothly, stepping closer. "And what is a century of vows compared to the survival of your pack? The Shadow Pack is amassing on your northern borders. You need our strength to repel them, and my alpha will not lend his armies to a king who refuses to bind our bloodlines. I will not betray my mate," David growled, the alpha power rolling off him in waves. "It's not betrayal, it's statecraft," Alara argued, her hand reaching out to trace the silver embroidery on his tunic. "A necessary sacrifice. And who knows, David, you might even enjoy it." Before he could react, she closed the distance between them, pressing her lips to his. It was a desperate, calculated move, meant to force his hand, to bind him in a moment of weakness. David froze, revulsion warring with the stark reality of her words. He needed the southern armies. Without them, Silverpine would fall. But this was unthinkable. He raised his hands to push her away, to tear himself from her grasp, when a sound shattered the silence. A ragged gasp, followed by a voice that chilled him to the bone. 100 years, David." He wrenched himself free, his golden eyes wide with horror as he turned towards the sound. Lisa stood at the edge of the grove, the moonlight illuminating the absolute devastation etched onto her face. The silver diadem glinted mockingly in her dark hair. "Lisa," David breathed, the word tasting like ash in his mouth. "And you choose tonight, our sacred anniversary." to break them. Her voice was a whip crack, slicing through the stillness of the night. The treaty, the armies, the survival of the pack. It all vanished, replaced by the shattered look in his mate's eyes. The scent of rain, heavy and metallic, finally broke. The first fat drops splattering against the leaves, mirroring the tears that began to fall from Lisa's eyes. The reign of the Iron Wolf hadn't just fractured, it had shattered completely. The silence that followed Lisa's words was heavier than the impending storm. It was a physical weight, pressing down on David, suffocating him. He took a step towards her, his hand outstretched, a desperate plea forming on his lips. "Lisa, please, it's not what it looks like." The cliché tasted sour, inadequate. It was exactly what it looked like, even if the context was drastically different. Lisa didn't move. She didn't flinch. She simply stared at him, her eyes, usually a warm, vibrant hazel, now cold and hard as obsidian. "Not what it looks like?" Her voice was eerily calm, devoid of the hysterical edge he might have expected. "I see my mate, the Alpha King of Silverpine, locking lips with the southern emissary on the night we are meant to renew our vows. Tell me, David, what does it look like?" Alara, recovering quickly, stepped forward, her amber eyes flashing with a mixture of defiance and calculating ambition. "Queen Lisa, you misunderstand. This is a matter of state." "Silence!" Lisa's command was a physical blow, laced with an Alpha Queen's authority. Even Alara, a high-ranking wolf in her own right, stumbled back, eyes wide. Lisa turned her gaze back to David. "I am speaking to my mate. Or rather, the man who used to be my mate." The word struck David like a physical blow. He felt the bond, the ethereal tether that connected their souls, shiver and groan under the strain of her proclamation. "Lisa, you must listen to me. The Shadow Pack. They are massing at the border. I needed the southern armies. Alara's Alpha demanded a union, a political marriage. And your first instinct was to comply?" The calmness was breaking, replaced by a simmering fury that terrified him more than any rogue attack. "Your first instinct was to betray me, to betray our bond, for an army." "I didn't comply," David roared, the frustration and panic finally boiling over. "I was pushing her away. I would never." "You were hesitating," Lisa interrupted, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "I saw it, David. For a fraction of a second, you considered it. You weighed my worth against the worth of an army." David opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. Had he? In that split second, when Alara had presented the stark reality of their situation, had a traitorous part of his mind considered the unthinkable? The silence was his admission. Lisa let out a choked breath, a sound that tore at his heart. She reached up, her fingers trembling slightly, and unclasped the silver diadem from her hair, the symbol of her queenship, a gift he had given her on their mating night a century ago. "Lisa, no, please." David stepped forward again, desperation clawing at his insides. She held the diadem out, the metal glinting coldly in the moonlight. "I accepted this crown because I believed in the man who gave it to me. I believed in his honor, his strength, and his unwavering love. That man is gone." She dropped the diadem. It hit the soft forest floor with a dull thud, a sound that echoed like a death knell in the quiet grove. "I, Lisa, relinquish my claim as Queen of Silverpine," she stated, her voice ringing clear and steady, invoking the ancient rites of severance. "You can't do this," David shouted, rushing forward to grab her arm. She snarled, a visceral, primal sound, and shoved him back with surprising force. "Do not touch me." Her eyes glowed with a terrifying inner light. "The bond is broken, David. You broke it." She turned and began to walk away, back towards the path that led to the moon tree, back towards the pack that was waiting for a ceremony that would never happen. "Lisa, wait!" David called after her, his voice cracking. "Where are you going?" She paused, looking over her shoulder one last time. To tell the pack that their king has secured their safety, at the cost of his soul. She disappeared into the shadows, leaving David standing in the rain, the discarded diadem at his feet, and Ilara watching him with a predatory glint in her eye. The scent of jasmine was gone, washed away by the storm, replaced only by the bitter smell of wet earth and utter ruin. He had saved his pack, perhaps, but he had lost everything that made saving them worthwhile. The rain had stopped by the time David returned to the great hall. The oppressive silence that hung over the courtyard was a stark contrast to the boisterous celebration he had left behind. Word had spread with the unnatural speed of a pack link, even though Lisa had formally severed hers. The pack knew. They felt the phantom ache of the broken bond, a collective shiver that ran through the heart of Silverpine. He found Elias waiting in the anteroom of his private chambers. The beta looked older, the lines around his eyes deepened by the sudden, brutal shift in their reality. "She's gone," Elias stated, his voice flat, devoid of its usual warmth. "Where?" David asked, his own voice sounding hollow, a raspy echo in the large stone room. He sank into a heavy oak chair, burying his face in his hands. "She took a horse. Said she needed to be away from the territory. From you." Elias paused, the silence stretching taut between them. "Is it true, David? What they are whispering?" David didn't look up. "That I kissed the southern emissary? Yes." The admission felt like swallowing broken glass. "That I betrayed Lisa? No. I was trying to secure an alliance. The Shadow Pack. Damn the Shadow Pack!" Elias exploded, slamming a fist against the stone wall. The sudden violence startled David, who looked up to see his oldest friend trembling with suppressed rage. "You think this pack, our pack, would want to survive at the cost of their queen? At the cost of their king's honor?" It was a split-second decision, Elias. A moment of weakness that I was trying to rectify when she found us. David pleaded, desperate for someone to understand the impossible weight he had been carrying. "A moment of weakness that cost you your mate," Elias retorted, his tone unforgiving. "You know the laws, David. A broken mating bond. It's not just a divorce. It's a tear in the fabric of the pack. The alpha's stability is tied to his mate. Without her, your control, your authority, it will be questioned." "I am still their king," David growled, a flicker of his alpha aura rising, a defensive instinct kicking in. Elias met his gaze, unflinching. "For now. But you are a king who traded his soul for an army. The pack will not easily forgive that. And neither will I." Elias turned on his heel and strode out of the room, leaving David alone with the crushing weight of his choices. He had expected anger, perhaps disappointment, but not this absolute condemnation. He had tried to be a king, to put the needs of the many before his own. And in doing so, he had destroyed the only thing that mattered. He spent the night pacing the length of his chambers, the phantom pain of the severed bond a constant, throbbing ache in his chest. It felt as though a vital organ had been ripped out, leaving behind a cold, empty void. He remembered their first meeting, a century ago. A chance encounter near the borderlands. She had been fiercely independent, a lone wolf challenging his authority. It had taken years to earn her trust, to convince her that his love was stronger than his need for control. and he had thrown it all away in a single, misguided moment. As dawn broke, casting long gray shadows across the stone floor, a tentative knock broke the silence. A young guard, barely out of his adolescence, entered nervously. "My king," the boy stammered, avoiding David's bloodshot eyes. "The southern emissary requests an audience." David felt a surge of pure, unadulterated hatred. Ilara. She had orchestrated this. She had seen his vulnerability and exploited it with ruthless precision. "Send her in," David commanded, his voice deadly calm. Ilara entered with the confidence of a conqueror, her amber eyes sparkling with a victorious gleam. She didn't bow, didn't offer any sign of deference. "A difficult night, I imagine, Alpha," she purred, taking a seat uninvited. "What do you want, Ilara?" David asked, resting his hands flat on the heavy oak desk, fighting the urge to shift and tear her throat out. "To finalize the treaty, of course," she replied smoothly, pulling a scroll from her cloak. "With Queen Lisa gone, there is nothing standing in the way of our union. My Alpha will be pleased. The southern armies will march within the week." David stared at her, a cold realization dawning on him. She truly believed he would go through with it. She believed that with Lisa out of the picture, he would simply fold, accept the political marriage, and secure the alliance. He stood up slowly, leaning across the desk, his golden eyes blazing with a dangerous primal light. The scent of ozone, the precursor to a violent shift, crackled in the air. "You miscalculated, Ilara," David said, his voice dropping to a terrifyingly soft growl. "You assumed that my desperation for an army outweighed my devotion to my mate. You assumed that because I stumbled, I had fallen." Ilara's confident smile faltered slightly. "Be reasonable, David. You need us." "I need my pack to survive, yes," David acknowledged, his gaze never leaving hers. "But I will not lead them as a puppet king, bought and paid for with betrayal." He reached out and snatched the scroll from her hand. With a swift, fluid motion, he tore it in half, then again, letting the pieces flutter to the floor. "Tell your Alpha," David continued, his voice echoing in the silent room, "that the Iron Wolf does not bow to coercion. Tell him that if the Shadow Pack comes, we will face them alone. And tell him that if any southern wolf crosses my border without invitation, they will not leave it alive." Ilara stared at him, shock and fury warring on her face. "You're a fool. You're condemning your pack to death." "I am condemning them to fight for their freedom, rather than live in chains," David retorted. "Now get out of my sight, before I forget my role as king and remember my nature as a wolf." Ilara hesitated for a fraction of a second before turning and fleeing the room. David watched her go, a grim satisfaction settling over him. He had lost Lisa. He had likely lost the loyalty of his beta. He was facing a war he might not win. But for the first time since he had stepped out of the shadows beneath the moon tree, he felt a sliver of his honor return. The king was broken, but he was not yet defeated. 3 months had passed since the night of the shattered crown. 3 months of brutal, grueling preparation. The southern armies never materialized, Ilara's Alpha proving true to his threat. The Shadow Pack, sensing weakness, had intensified their raids along the northern border. David threw himself into the defense of Silverpine with a ferocity that terrified even his most seasoned warriors. He was the first into the fray, the last to retreat, a whirlwind of claws and teeth that seemed impervious to pain or exhaustion. The pack whispered that he fought like a wolf with nothing left to lose, and they were right. The void left by Lisa's absence was a constant, gnawing agony, only temporarily silenced by the adrenaline of battle. Elias fought by his side, their bond strained but unbroken by the shared necessity of survival. But the warmth was gone, replaced by a grim, utilitarian partnership. The pack, too, treated David differently. They followed his orders without question. They respected his strength. But the reverence was missing. He was their general now, no longer their beloved king. It was during a particularly vicious skirmish near the Howling Peaks that the tide began to turn. The Shadow Pack had ambushed a patrol, outnumbering them 3-1. David, Elias, and a handful of warriors were fighting a losing battle, cornered against a sheer rock face. A massive shadow wolf, its fur matted with dried blood, lunged for Elias, who was already injured, favoring his left hind leg. David roared, leaping to intercept, but he was too far away, entangled with 2 other attackers. Suddenly, a blur of silver and black tore through the undergrowth. A smaller, incredibly agile wolf hit the massive shadow wolf with the force of a battering ram, sending it crashing into the rocks. The silver wolf didn't pause, twisting mid-air to slash the throat of another attacker before landing gracefully beside Elias. David froze, his heart slamming against his ribs. He knew that scent. He knew that fighting style. Even shifted, even covered in mud and blood, the grace was unmistakable. Lisa. She fought with a cold, precise fury, a silent tempest that decimated the remaining shadow wolves. When the last attacker fled, she shifted back to her human form, standing amidst the carnage, chest heaving, eyes blazing. She wore a simple leather tunic and trousers, her hair cropped shorter, practical, and severe. She looked older, harder, and more breathtakingly beautiful than he remembered. Elias shifted back, clutching his bleeding side, his eyes wide with shock. Lisa? How? I heard the howls, she said simply, her gaze sweeping over the exhausted, battered patrol before finally settling on David. I couldn't stay away. Not when the pack is bleeding. David stepped forward, his body trembling, the urge to pull her into his arms almost overwhelming. Lisa, he breathed, her name a prayer on his lips. You came back. She held up a hand, halting his advance. I came back for the pack, David. Not for you. Her voice was devoid of warmth, a cool, detached statement of fact. The word stung, but he nodded, accepting the boundary. Thank you. Your timing was impeccable. We need to get Elias back to the healers, she stated, ignoring his gratitude. She turned to the beta, offering her shoulder. Can you walk? I think so, Elias muttered, leaning heavily on her. He looked from Lisa to David, a silent question in his eyes. Lead the way, David said softly, falling back to guard their rear. The journey back to Silverpine was fraught with tension. The pack erupted in a mixture of shock, joy, and apprehension upon seeing their former queen return, bloodied but victorious. The healers whisked Elias away, leaving David and Lisa standing awkwardly in the courtyard. I have a spare room in the eastern wing, David offered, breaking the silence. You can stay there. It's quiet. Lisa shook her head. No, I'll stay in the barracks with the warriors. The barracks? Lisa, you're a queen. I relinquished that title, remember? She interrupted sharply. I am here as a fighter, David. Nothing more. Don't try to make this something it isn't. She turned and walked away, her posture rigid, leaving David standing in the fading light, the phantom pain of the severed bond flaring with renewed intensity. She was back, but the distance between them felt wider than ever. The physical proximity only highlighted the emotional chasm he had created. That night, David sat in his war room, staring at the maps, the movement of the Shadow Pack marked in red ink. But his mind wasn't on strategy. It was on the silver wolf fighting beside him. It was on the coldness in her eyes. He knew he couldn't force a reconciliation. He had broken her trust, shattered the foundation of their century-long bond. Words were useless. Apologies were empty echoes. If he ever wanted her back, not just as a fighter, but as his mate, he had to prove it. He had to rebuild the trust he had destroyed, stone by painful stone. The next morning, Lisa joined the training drills. She was relentless, pushing the younger warriors harder than they had ever been pushed, her tactical brilliance evident in every maneuver. David watched from a distance, recognizing the pain beneath her stoic facade. She was burying her grief in action, a tactic he understood all too well. During a sparring session, a young brash warrior, eager to prove himself, overstepped. He threw a cheap shot, catching Lisa off guard and sending her sprawling. Before the young wolf could press his advantage, David intervened. He didn't shift, he didn't roar. He simply stepped between them, his alpha aura flaring with cold, precise authority. "That's enough," David said, his voice low, his gaze fixed on the young warrior. "We fight with honor, or we don't fight at all." He offered his hand to Lisa. She hesitated for a fraction of a second, her eyes searching his face before taking it. He pulled her up, his grip firm but gentle, letting go the moment she was steady. "Thank you," she muttered, brushing dirt from her trousers. He was out of line. David replied simply, turning away before he could read too much into the brief contact. It was a small gesture, a tiny step, but it was a start. He would fight the Shadow Pack with tooth and claw. But the real war, the battle for Lisa's heart, that he would fight with patience and humility. I will continue with the next part of the story in the following response. The Great Hall, once a sanctuary of celebration and warmth, had been stripped of its finery. The long, polished oak tables where the pack had feasted on the night of the shattered crown were now pushed together, buried beneath sprawling, hand-drawn maps of the Silver Pine territory. The air smelled of damp wool, burning tallow candles, and the bitter tang of stale coffee. David stood at the head of the table, his knuckles resting on the heavy parchment. The shadows beneath his eyes were bruised and deep, a testament to weeks of fragmented sleep. Around the table stood his remaining lieutenants, Elias favoring his injured leg on a sturdy wooden cane, and, standing deliberately at the farthest end, Lisa. "They're funneling through the jagged pass at the Howling Peaks," David said, his voice a low, gravelly hum that commanded the room. He tapped a charcoal-stained finger against a narrow gorge on the map. "Malachor knows our numbers are depleted. He's trying to force a bottleneck, bleed our border patrols dry before making a push for the main settlement." Elias leaned heavily on his cane, a grimace tightening his features. "We don't have the manpower to hold the pass indefinitely, David. If they commit their full force, they'll break through the line within 3 days. Then we don't hold it." A cool voice echoed from the end of the table. Every eye turned to Lisa. She wasn't looking at any of them. Her gaze was fixed intently on the topographical lines of the map. She wore a dark, fitted combat tunic, her silver-handled hunting knives strapped securely to her thighs. She looked entirely in her element, an apex predator analyzing her prey. David kept his expression carefully neutral, though his heart hammered a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs at the sound of her voice. "Explain," he requested, keeping his tone strictly professional. "Holding a bottleneck only works if you have reinforcements waiting on the other side," Lisa said, tracing a line through the map with the tip of a dagger. "We don't. We are the reinforcements. If Malachor breaks the line at the peaks, our fighters will be slaughtered, and he'll have a clear run down the valley." She looked up, her hazel eyes meeting David's golden stare with unflinching intensity. "We need to concede the pass." A murmur of dissent rippled through the lieutenants. Giving up territory was anathema to a wolf pack. It went against every primal instinct they possessed. "Quiet," David commanded, the single word silencing the room instantly. He didn't look away from Lisa. "You want to invite them into the valley. I want to draw them into the Whispering Woods," Lisa corrected, her dagger tapping a dense patch of forest closer to their settlement. "The terrain there is treacherous. Sinkholes, dense undergrowth, no clear sight lines. The Shadow Pack relies on brute force and numbers. In the woods, numbers mean nothing. It becomes a guerrilla war. We know those woods. They don't." Elias frowned, studying the map. "It's a massive risk. If we fail to contain them in the woods, they are less than an hour's run from the heart of the village. The elders, the pups, they'd be entirely exposed." "They're exposed now," Lisa countered coldly. "If we bleed out at the pass, there will be no one left to defend the village anyway. We have to fight them on our terms, not theirs." David stared at the map, visualizing the terrain. She was right. It was a terrifying, high-stakes gamble. But it was tactically sound. It was the kind of brilliant, ruthless strategy that had made her a legendary queen. "We pull the patrols back at dusk," David announced, making the decision. "We fall back to the Whispering Woods and prepare an ambush." Before anyone could argue, the heavy oak doors of the great hall burst open. A scout, a young woman covered in mud and shivering violently, stumbled into the room. She was practically carried by 2 guards. "Report," David ordered, crossing the room in 3 long strides. "They breached the outer perimeter, Alpha," the scout gasped, coughing up a spatter of dark blood. "But it's worse. Malachor, he isn't alone." "Explain," Elias demanded, limping forward. "They had southern steel," the scout wheezed, her eyes wide with terror. "Curved blades, and they smelled like the desert, like spice and snake venom." A suffocating silence fell over the room. David felt a cold dread settle in the pit of his stomach. Ilara. The emissary hadn't just walked away when he rejected her political marriage. She had gone straight to his enemy, providing the Shadow Pack with the weapons and likely the mercenaries they needed to ensure Silverpine's destruction. He looked down the table at Lisa. The accusation he expected to see in her eyes wasn't there. Instead, there was only a chilling, pragmatic acceptance. She had known the price of his refusal, just as he had. "Prepare the defenses in the woods," David said, his voice dropping to a lethal, deadly whisper. "Tonight, we don't just fight for our territory. We fight for our lives." Winter arrived in Silverpine not with a gentle frost, but with a violent, howling blizzard that swept down from the mountains, coating the Whispering Woods in a thick layer of treacherous, blinding white. The temperature plummeted, turning the damp earth into iron and freezing the breath in their lungs. David crouched low behind the massive trunk of a fallen cedar, the rough bark scraping against his leather armor. His senses were dialed to their absolute peak, filtering the chaotic symphony of the storm. The wind shrieked through the bare branches, masking the sounds of movement. But it couldn't mask the scent: wet fur, rotted meat, and the sharp, metallic tang of southern steel. They were here. He caught a flash of movement to his left, a massive, hulking shadow slipping between the snow-draped pines. David didn't issue a vocal command. A simple, sharp projection of his alpha intent pulsed through the pack link. Now. The woods erupted. Silverpine warriors dropped from the branches and burst from beneath camouflaged snowdrifts, a coordinated wave of teeth, claws, and flashing blades. The ambush was perfectly timed, catching the vanguard of the Shadow Pack completely by surprise. David shifted mid-leap, his human form exploding into the massive, midnight black bulk of the Iron Wolf. He hit a southern mercenary, a man wielding twin curved blades with the force of a runaway train. Bone crunched beneath his jaws, the metallic taste of blood flooding his senses. He didn't pause, using his momentum to spin and drag his claws across the throat of a shadow wolf, attempting to flank him. Through the chaos of the melee, his gaze constantly sought one particular fighter. Lisa was a terrifying vision in the snow. She fought in her human form, dual-wielding her silver knives, moving with a fluid, balletic grace that belied the devastating lethality of her strikes. She used the trees, the snowbanks, the very momentum of her enemies against them. A silver phantom weaving through the carnage, they found themselves fighting back to back near the center of the skirmish, an ancient, instinctual rhythm taking over. It was a dance they had perfected over a century of defending their borders. A shadow wolf lunged at David's blind spot. Lisa's knife found its eye before it left the ground. A mercenary swung a heavy mace at Lisa's head. David's jaws clamped onto the man's arm, tearing it from the socket. For a breathless, fleeting moment, the severed bond between them seemed to spark to life. A phantom current of shared adrenaline and perfect anticipation. It felt terrifyingly right. It felt like home. Then, a scream tore through the howling wind. David snapped his massive head around. A dozen yards away, a young Silverpine warrior, the same brash youth who had tripped Lisa in training, was pinned to the ground by Malachor himself. The Shadow Alpha was monstrous, his fur scarred and gray, his eyes burning with a sadistic yellow light. He raised a massive, clawed paw, ready to gut the boy. Before David could close the distance, a silver blur intercepted. Lisa didn't hesitate. She threw herself between Malachor and the boy, crossing her knives to block the downward strike of the Alpha's claws. The impact was deafening. The sheer force of Malachor's blow drove Lisa to her knees, the icy ground cracking beneath her. "Run!" she screamed at the terrified boy, holding the massive Alpha back with every ounce of her strength. Malachor snarled, a twisted smile pulling at his snout. He twisted his wrist, bypassing her crossed blades, and drove a single, wickedly curved claw deep into the juncture between her shoulder and her chest. Lisa gasped, her eyes going wide as the dark, unnatural poison coating the claw immediately began to hiss against her blood. The sound that tore from David's throat wasn't a howl. It was a demonic roar that shook the snow from the trees. The phantom bond shattered, replaced by a blinding, absolute rage. He crossed the distance in a single, impossible leap. He didn't just attack Malachor. He descended upon him like a force of nature. David's jaws locked onto the Shadow Alpha's throat, his momentum carrying them both crashing through the brush and into a massive oak. Malachor clawed frantically at David's face, tearing through flesh and fur. But David didn't feel it. He twisted violently, snapping Malachor's neck with a sickening crunch. He spat the dead Alpha onto the snow, shifting back to his human form in the same fluid motion, ignoring his own bleeding wounds as he dropped to his knees beside Lisa. She was lying on her side in the crimson-stained snow, her breath coming in shallow, ragged gasps. The wound at her shoulder was bubbling, the edges of the flesh turning a necrotic, sickly black. "Lisa," David choked out, his hands hovering over her, terrified to cause her more pain. She looked up at him, her hazel eyes clouded with agony and rapidly spreading fever. "Don't," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Don't lose the woods." Her eyes rolled back, and she went entirely limp, the silver knives slipping from her grasp. The infirmary smelled of scorched sage, strong antiseptic alcohol, and the coppery stench of blood. The storm raged outside, rattling the thick glass panes of the stone building, but inside, the silence was thick and oppressive. David sat on a low wooden stool beside a narrow cot, his forearms resting on his knees, his head bowed. He had refused medical attention for the deep claw marks, tracking across his face and chest, waving the frantic healers away. The physical pain was a distant, insignificant hum compared to the agonizing terror twisting in his gut. Lisa lay on the cot, pale as the snow outside. The wound on her shoulder had been cleaned and bound, but the dark, insidious veins of Malicor's poison were visibly creeping up her neck, branching out like the roots of a dead tree under her skin. She was burning with a violent fever, her head thrashing weakly against the pillow, her lips moving in silent, delirious conversation. "The southern venom is moving too fast, Alpha," muttered Alara, the head healer, a woman who had served the pack longer than David had been alive. She wiped a damp cloth across Lisa's forehead, her expression grave. Her body is fighting it, but without her wolf. Without the accelerated healing of a complete mate bond, she isn't strong enough to purge it. David's head snapped up, his golden eyes flashing with a dangerous, desperate light. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying the herbs aren't working," the healer replied gently, laying a weathered hand on his rigid shoulder. "The poison is attacking her nervous system. If it reaches her heart—" She didn't need to finish the sentence. No. The word was absolute, a royal decree spoken into the quiet room. David stood, pushing the stool back. "I won't allow it. Leave us." The healer hesitated. "Alpha, there is nothing more to be." "I said, leave us," David growled, the alpha resonance vibrating the vials on the wooden shelves. The healer bowed her head and hurried from the room, pulling the heavy oak door shut behind her. David was alone with the woman he had shattered. He looked down at her, at the dark hair plastered to her sweat-slicked face, at the terrifying black veins creeping toward her heart. He had broken the bond. He had caused the vulnerability that was now killing her. It was a crushing, suffocating realization. He didn't have the mating bond to anchor her, to share his strength with her, but he was still the Alpha King. He had power, ancient and raw, flowing through his blood. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble to force alpha energy into an unbound wolf. But it was the only card he had left to play. He climbed carefully onto the cot, positioning himself beside her. He took her burning, limp hand in his left and pressed his right palm flat against the bandages over her heart. He closed his eyes, drawing a deep, steadying breath, and reached inward, tapping into the deep, roaring well of his alpha power. "Take it," he commanded silently, pushing a wave of golden, healing energy down his arm and into her chest. The moment his energy met the poison, Lisa arched off the bed with a strangled, agonizing cry. Her eyes snapped open, unseeing and dilated, staring blindly at the stone ceiling. "Hold on," David whispered, his own body trembling as he forced the power into her. He could feel the poison pushing back, a cold, oily resistance fighting his light. It felt like holding his hand in a raging fire. But he didn't pull away. He pushed harder. "David," Lisa mumbled, her voice frail, caught in the grip of her delirium. She wasn't seeing the infirmary. She was somewhere else. 100 years, promised. A tear slipped free from David's closed eyes, tracking down his blood-streaked face. "I know, my love. I know I broke it. I'm sorry." "The tree," she whimpered, her fingers weakly clutching his hand. "The leaves are falling. It's so cold." "Why is it so cold?" "I'm here," he promised, his voice cracking, pouring more energy into her, fighting the black roots that were strangling her heart. "I'm right here. I'm not leaving you." "You chose an army," she sobbed. a single devastating tear sliding down her pale cheek, even in her unconscious state. "You traded me." The words were a dagger twisting in his already shredded conscience. He didn't offer excuses. He didn't try to explain the tactical necessity or the split-second hesitation that had damned him. In the quiet darkness of the infirmary, with her life slipping through his fingers, only the absolute, undeniable truth mattered. "I was a coward," David confessed to the empty room, his forehead resting against hers, his tears mingling with her fever sweat. "I was terrified of losing the pack, and in my fear, I destroyed my soul. I would burn this entire territory to ash to take that moment back, Lisa. I would let the Southern armies march over my bones just to see you smile at me again." He pushed one final, massive surge of alpha energy into her, a roaring tide of golden light that felt as though it was tearing his own life force away. Lisa gasped, a violent shudder ripping through her frame. The black veins on her neck pulsed once, darkly, and then slowly, agonizingly, began to recede, retreating beneath her skin. Her rapid, shallow breathing deepened, settling into a heavy, exhausted rhythm. David collapsed back onto his heels beside the cot, his chest heaving, his vision swimming with exhaustion. He had pushed the poison back, buying her time, giving her strong immune system a chance to fight. He gently brushed a damp strand of hair from her face, his bloody, trembling fingers lingering against her cheek. She was alive. But as he looked at the cold, beautiful stillness of her face, he knew the poison in her blood was only half the battle. The poison in her heart, the betrayal he had planted there, remained untouched. Dawn broke over Silverpine, not with a triumphant sunrise, but with a pale, bruised light that filtered through the heavy gray clouds. The blizzard had finally exhausted itself, leaving the whispering woods buried beneath a suffocating blanket of silent white. Inside the infirmary, the heavy scent of blood and scorched sage had settled into a stale, metallic musk. David woke to the sensation of bone-deep, paralyzing cold. He was slumped in the wooden chair beside the cot, his body aching with a profound, terrifying emptiness. The alpha spark, the roaring furnace of energy that had defined his existence for over a century, was reduced to a fragile, flickering ember. He felt entirely human, fragile, and overwhelmingly mortal. He forced his heavy eyelids open, his neck screaming in protest as he lifted his head. His gaze immediately locked onto the narrow cot. Lisa was still asleep, but the terrifying, deathly pallor had vanished from her skin. The jagged, necrotic lines of Malicor's poison had entirely retreated, leaving behind angry, red-puckered flesh at her shoulder. But the dark corruption was gone. Her chest rose and fell in a steady, deep rhythm. The fever had broken. The heavy oak door creaked open, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Elias limped in, his wooden cane thumping softly against the stone floor. He looked haggard, his arm bound tightly against his chest, his face smeared with soot and dried blood. He stopped at the foot of the cot, his eyes moving from Lisa's peaceful face to David's ruined one. Elias's breath hitched slightly as he took in the sight of his alpha. David's normally rich, dark hair was heavily streaked with stark, sudden silver. The skin around his eyes was bruised, his regal posture slumped and hollowed out. "The shadow pack is broken," Elias reported, his voice a low, gravelly raspy. He kept his tone carefully neutral, refusing to shatter the fragile peace of the room. With Malicor dead and their vanguard decimated, the survivors broke ranks and fled back toward the jagged pass. Our patrols are tracking them to ensure they leave the territory, but the threat is neutralized. "Casualties?" David asked, his voice barely more than a dry whisper. "Heavy," Elias admitted, his gaze dropping to the floor. 14 dead, thrice that number wounded. But the village is untouched. The elders and the pups are safe. Your strategy, her strategy, It worked. David nodded slowly, the movement sending a fresh wave of exhaustion washing over him. Set up a perimeter guard. Double the watch on the southern border. Alara's Alpha may try to capitalize on our weakened state. Elias hesitated, leaning his weight onto his cane. David, you need a healer. The claw marks on your face, your chest, and your energy. I can barely feel your presence through the pack link. You feel hollow. I've forced an alpha spark into an unbound wolf to burn out the venom, David stated flatly, offering no further explanation. Elias's eyes widened in horror. It was an ancient, forbidden desperation move, one that usually killed the recipient and permanently crippled the alpha. You drained yourself. David, you could have died. If the pack senses how weak you are... I don't care, David interrupted, his golden eyes flashing with a brief, stubborn spark of their usual fire. I would have drained every drop of blood in my body if it meant keeping her heart beating. Let the pack whisper. I am still their king. A faint rustle of linen drew both their eyes back to the cot. Lisa shifted, a quiet groan escaping her dry lips. Her eyelashes fluttered, parting to reveal eyes that were hazy and disoriented. She blinked against the dull morning light, her gaze drifting aimlessly before finally locking onto David. Elias gave a short, respectful bow. I will leave you, Alpha. Welcome back, Lisa. He slipped out of the room, pulling the door securely shut. The silence that followed was suffocating. David remained frozen in his chair, suddenly terrified. He had fought a warlord and conquered death itself to keep her here, but facing her waking gaze felt infinitely more daunting. Lisa tried to push herself up, wincing sharply as her shoulder protested. Don't move, David urged, his voice cracking. He instinctively reached out, his hand hovering over hers, but he caught himself, pulling his fingers back and resting his hands firmly on his own knees. The poison is gone, but the tissue damage is severe. You need to rest. She looked at his empty hands, and then up at his face. Her gaze roamed over the deep, jagged scratches tearing across his cheek and jaw, the matted blood on his chest, and finally, the shocking streaks of silver in his hair. She closed her eyes, taking a slow, trembling breath as she focused inward. You forced an alpha transfer, she whispered, her voice incredibly fragile. She didn't ask. She stated it as a terrifying fact. She could feel the lingering, golden warmth of his essence curled protectively around her heart. The herbs weren't working, David said softly. It was in your veins. It was the only way. You could have destroyed your own core, Lisa countered, opening her eyes to look at him. There was no anger in her gaze, only a profound, exhausted sorrow. You risked the stability of the entire pack to save a lone wolf. I risked it to save you, David corrected, leaning forward, the raw honesty stripping away the last of his kingly facade. I told you, Lisa. I would burn it all down to take that night back. I couldn't lose you. Not like this. Not because you were protecting a pack I failed. Lisa looked away, staring at the rough stone ceiling. A single tear slipped from the corner of her eye, tracking into her dark hair. You gave me back my life, David. And for that, I am in your debt. You fought with honor today. The word debt struck him like a physical blow. It was cold, transactional. But you must know, she continued, her voice trembling slightly, that blood and magic can heal the flesh. They can purge poison, but they cannot fix what you broke under the moon tree. A forced spark doesn't reforge a bond. I know, David said, his voice thick with unshed tears. He slowly sank from the chair to his knees, kneeling beside her cot on the cold stone floor. He didn't ask for her hand. He didn't ask for her forgiveness. I am not asking for absolution, Lisa. I am not expecting you to put the crown back on. But I am asking for time. Let me prove that the man you loved didn't die that night. Let me earn my way back. Lisa turned her head, looking at the broken, exhausted king kneeling in the ashes of their former life. She reached out, her fingers trembling as they gently brushed against the uninjured side of his jaw. "We have time," she whispered softly. "That's all we have left." 6 months later, the Whispering Woods were alive with the vibrant, chaotic energy of spring. The snow had long since melted, giving way to a carpet of vibrant green ferns and the sweet, heavy scent of blooming wildflowers. The village of Silverpine had transformed. The damaged perimeter walls were rebuilt stronger, fortified with stone and heavy timber. The political landscape had shifted as dramatically as the seasons. Word of Malakor's death at the hands of the Iron Wolf and the subsequent routing of the Shadow Pack had spread across the territories like wildfire. The southern packs, recognizing their gross miscalculation, had sent a new emissary. An older, deferential male who brought gifts of grain and steel, offering a formal apology and a treaty of non-aggression, asking for nothing in return. David had accepted the treaty standing in the courtyard, with Elias on his right and Lisa standing a few paces to his left. She didn't wear a crown, nor did she stand at his side as a mate. She wore the dark leather of a general, her presence alone projecting an aura of lethal, untouchable authority that sent the southern emissary scrambling back to his horse. The pack had adapted to the new dynamic. They respected David's renewed dedication, the quiet, humble strength he now possessed. And they revered Lisa. She was their protector, their sword in the dark. The unspoken tension between their two leaders was a constant, humming undercurrent in the village, a dance of careful proximity and respectful distance. It was the anniversary, not of their mating, but of the night the crown was shattered. The air in the great hall was subdued as evening approached. There was no feast, no music. The pack gave David a wide berth as he walked through the corridors, dressed in a simple, unadorned tunic. He didn't ask for an escort. He walked alone, stepping out into the cool evening air and following the familiar, glowing path of mushrooms toward the ancient forest. He carried a small wooden box in his hands, his fingers tracing the smooth, polished grain. The clearing was exactly as it had been a year ago. The moon tree stood as a silent, luminous sentinel, its silver leaves shimmering softly in the twilight. The scent of ozone and old magic lingered in the air. David stopped at the edge of the grove, the memory of Lisa's devastated face flashing behind his eyes, a phantom pain twisting his chest. He walked slowly toward the massive trunk of the tree and knelt among the sprawling, ancient roots. He set the wooden box on the mossy ground and opened it. Inside, resting on a bed of dark velvet, was the silver diadem. He didn't speak. He simply knelt there, a solitary king confronting the ghosts of his own hubris, offering a silent prayer of contrition to the earth and the ancestors. The faint snap of a twig broke the absolute silence. David didn't turn around. He recognized the scent instantly. Night-blooming jasmine mingled with the crisp, clean scent of the forest. His heart executed a frantic, hopeful rhythm against his ribs. But he remained still, giving her the choice to approach or retreat. Footsteps fell softly against the moss, moving slowly into his peripheral vision. Lisa stepped into the ethereal light of the moon tree. She wore a simple linen dress, the fabric shifting like liquid silver in the glow. The scar on her shoulder was hidden, but he knew it was there, a permanent brand of the battle they had fought. She looked down at the wooden box, at the gleaming silver diadem resting in the velvet. "I didn't expect you to come here tonight," David said softly, his voice rough with emotion. He kept his gaze fixed on the tree, afraid that looking directly at her might break the spell. A year ago, I left this clearing believing I had lost everything. Lisa replied, her voice calm, devoid of the jagged anger that had defined their last encounter here. She lowered herself gracefully to the ground, sitting beside him among the roots, leaving a deliberate hand's breadth of space between them. I believed the man I loved was dead, replaced by a politician who valued an army over a soul. David swallowed hard, the truth of her words stinging just as sharply as it had a year prior. You were right to leave. I was, she agreed smoothly. She turned her head, her hazel eyes studying his profile. The silver streaks in his hair remained, a permanent testament to the life force he had surrendered for her. But you surprised me, David. When the Southern emissary came back, you didn't even hesitate. You sent him away. I learned my lesson, David murmured, finally turning to meet her gaze. I would rather Silver Pine fall fighting on its feet than survive on its knees. And I would rather live the rest of my life alone than spend another second betraying you. Lisa reached out, her fingers gently grazing the edge of the wooden box. You saved the pack without selling your soul. And you saved me, even when you knew it wouldn't fix the bond. I didn't do it for the bond, Lisa, David said, his voice thick with desperate sincerity. I did it because the world is infinitely darker without you in it. Silence settled over the clearing, thick and heavy, but no longer suffocating. It was a healing silence, the kind that follows a devastating storm when the earth finally begins to drink the rain. Lisa reached into the box. David's breath hitched as her fingers brushed the cold silver of the diadem. She didn't lift it. Instead, she gently pushed the lid of the box closed, sealing the crown away in the darkness. David felt a crushing wave of disappointment, but he forced himself to nod, accepting her silent answer. He had pushed too hard. He had hoped for too much. Then, Lisa shifted her weight. She moved her hand from the box, closing the hand's breadth of space between them, and slipped her fingers into his. David froze, his entire body going rigid with shock as her cool skin pressed against his palm. He looked down at their joined hands, terrified to move, terrified to breathe. I am not ready to wear that crown, David, Lisa whispered, her thumb gently stroking the rough calluses on his knuckles. I'm not ready to be a queen again. The trust, it's still fragile. The bond is still quiet. She looked up at him, the ethereal light of the moon tree reflecting in the unshed tears swimming in her eyes. It wasn't a sudden, magical reconciliation. It was raw, honest, and painfully real. But I am ready to hold your hand, she said, her voice catching in her throat. I'm ready to walk out of this clearing with you. I'm ready to try and build something new. David closed his fingers around hers, holding on as if she were a lifeline in a raging sea. He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a reverent, trembling kiss to her knuckles, a mirror of the gesture he had made a year ago. But this time, fueled by profound humility rather than arrogant confidence. That's all I could ever ask for, he promised, his golden eyes locking onto hers. They sat beneath the ancient branches, two scarred, imperfect leaders holding on to one another in the quiet dark. The bond between them remained fractured, the echoes of betrayal still a distant hum. But as they stood up together, their hands tightly intertwined beneath the luminescent canopy, they took their first unified step out of the shadows. David and Lisa's journey proves that true leadership isn't about avoiding mistakes, but having the humility to face the devastating consequences and the courage to rebuild from the ashes. Their story reminds us that while betrayal can shatter a bond in a single moment, trust is a fortress rebuilt stone by agonizing stone. If this cinematic tale of heartbreak, redemption, and the raw realities of love and leadership captivated you, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe for more grounded, high-stakes drama. Drop a comment below. Would you have forgiven the Alpha King? What choices define true loyalty in your eyes?